We are learning Tafres Tzadik Dalet 5694. Which corresponds to Beis Volume 2. And we're on page 87. Actually, no, not on page 87. We moved already. We're on page 108, actually. 108. So let me sum up where we're at here. The general discussion is about the Ayin Be'emtza, the channel in between Yesh Amiti and Yesh Hanivra. The Ayin Beis began to discuss Das Elyon and Das Tachten, two different perspectives. The way the divine sees the picture from the top down, like the bird's eye view is Das Elyon, and Das Tachten is the perspective from below, how we see it from the eyes of existence, which was the end of the subject matter that we discussed about Shabbos and weekday. Man, Lechem min Hashamayim, Lechem min Haaretz were those two perspectives. So he moved into the discussion of Das and Das Tachen. To understand that, he went into Yesh, Ayin, and Yesh. Long discussion. What is Yesh Amiti? True existence, in contrast to created existence. And then there's an ayin in between, an interface that connects them. That ayin divides into two. The ayin of the Yesh Amiti, called Ayin Amiti. The ayin meaning the divine energy that reflects and relates to the source, the true reality, and the divine energy that reflects and that relates to created reality. And he gave three interpretations on what that ayin is. The first interpretation, we learned this as we summed up on page 107, the Frierdiker Rebbe summed up the three shittas. The first is that it's all before the tzimtzum, the essence, the core energy, and the expression of that energy. The second interpretation, it's Sevav and Mamala. In generally, the light before the tzimtzum and the energy in light after the tzimtzum. Sevav is transcendent energy. Mamala is immanent energy. And the third interpretation is both after the tzimtzum, in Mamala itself, you also have two levels of ayin. Now the discussion is, what are these two levels in the third interpretation? So the first explanation in the third interpretation, in the third approach, was that these are two levels in the kav. The kav is that thin, narrow line, like the paintbrush, that creates all of existence. So there's the top of the kav that's attached to its source. That's Maila. Lower levels are lower down in the kav as it gets diminished. So that's the Mailo Mato that the kav creates, and the whole discussion of how structure is created, multitude and distinction and diversity, but the process of how the tzimtzum and then the kav implement and create that structure. So the kav has two levels. The level before the tzimtzum, that's the ayin of the Yesh Amiti, and the kav, as it relates to existence, that's the ayin of the Yesh Hanivra. That's the first explanation in the third approach, in the third interpretation. Okay. Omnom be'emes, he says, and that's what we learned on Friday. And this again is from Ayin Beis, that in truth, it's deeper than that. When we say two levels of Mamala, we're talking even higher than the Kav. Remember, Mamala Kalaman is in general, the Kav is Mamala Kalaman, because the Kav is a structured line. It's not a circle. It's not an all-inclusive, all-encompassing energy. It's a specific energy. It's a paintbrush that actually creates distinction, not just mute, not just diminishes the light, but actual hischalkus be'etzem madregas, actual different distinct levels. But Mamala is a broader than the Kav, because Mamala really already wanted to have an Er HaGvul. So when he was envisioning In the Eir HaBligvul, he was envisioning the structure of existence. That's already the root of Mamala. He doesn't say it explicitly right here, but in Ayin Beis, that's a central theme. So he's going to explain now that there's a deeper way of understanding the two levels of Ayin in Mamala. And he compares it, just like we spoke in the first interpretation, that there's Etzem and Ispashtus in the Eir HaBligvul. There's the Etzem Eir that just reflects the source. And the Ispashtus Eir, the expression of that Eir. That's all Eir HaBligvul. The same thing is in Eir HaGvul, in Eir Mamala, there's also Etzem and Ispashtus. Even though this really should be said later, but I'll just say it now for clarity purposes. Before the Tzimtzum, the dominant Eir is Eir HaBligvul. He says, Eir HaBligvul Bizgabrus. Because before the Tzimtzum, before there's any diminishment of the Tzimtzum, it's all basically the divine energy, the divine expression, divine consciousness. That's Bligvul. In that Bligvul, we learn that God's divine consciousness, he wants to have levels. So therefore you have the level of Etzem Eir is just a reflection of the divine. His Pashtus Eir is where begin emerging in the divine Klali and the Ratzon HaKodum kind of shape and form. So in a sense, you already have shape and form, not in the real manifestation of it, because it's still all part of Bligvul before the Tzimtzum. But you have the beginnings of that shaping. So therefore, once the Tzimtzum takes place, what dominates after the Tzimtzum? Eir HaGvul, not Eir HaBligvul. So just like there's an Eir HaBligvul after the Tzimtzum, but it's really now channeled through the Eir HaGvul, through the Kav. We learned, remember the Kav creates also the Igulim, also the Bligvul, also the transcendent energy of Seviv, of Makif. And before the Tzimtzum is the other way around. The Eir HaBligvul is the dominant, and within it lies also the potential of the God Shir Atzmei B'Koyach, where God envisions the details and allocates resources, and what we say, allocates and Shir Atzmei, we don't like the word estimates, but prepares. He prepares the resources needed that will be implemented after the Tzimtzum. So that's important to remember. So if you say in general, Eir HaSeviv is more of a pre-Tzimtzum type of energy. However, as it goes lower, it starts getting subject to Pnimi, creating some form of structure in it. Eir HaMamala is primarily a post-Tzimtzum type of energy, but it also originates from pre-Tzimtzum. We'll talk about this more later. I just wanted to clarify. So right now, he's coming to say, says, just like we spoke about these words, the Kashem Shebe'er Shalifnei Tzimtzum. I'm reading the opening lines on page 107 of chapter 22 in Tzadik Dalet. Kashem Shebe'er Shalifnei Tzimtzum. Hainu Ba'er HaBligvul. U'kanal the Lifnei Tzimtzum HaBligvul is Gabas. B'kol Mokim Haragam Ba'er Zeh Yesh B'chinas Etzem V'Ispashtus. So the same thing, as I said, the conclusion of that line is going to be in the next page. Hinekenu gam b'ashita shlishis. Same will be also in the third interpretation and approach, that there's also etzem ispashtus in mamala kalaman, in the imminent energy. But before he gets there, we're now into a longer discussion of etzem and ispashtus. And the Frierdiker Rebbe introduced, to understand it, he introduced Chachma and Bina. That's what we're in the middle of learning now. Chachma and Bina, he says, the words of Frierdiker Rebbe, that Etzem Eir is Kashem Kumaya Etzem, it's not, doesn't have any expansion or extension or expression. And Ispashtus is about extension and expression. So he says, the Hine Etzem Ispashtus Yuvan will understand it in general from the two levels of Meichin of Chachma and Bina. What's very interesting here is using Chachma and Bina, which are defined entities that come after the Tzimtzum. He's using that to explain Etzem and Ispashtus before the Tzimtzum, which just teaches us a very important principle, And there were Mashpiyim, Rab Moshe Geradi and others from previous generation who focused very much to show that everything in the microcosm of Ishtalshalis in some way reflects Lifnei Tzimtzum. So even though Chachma and Bina do not become realities till after the Tzimtzum, because even the 10 hidden spheres are not really spheres, they're just within the divine consciousness, the possibility of spheres, envisioning of spheres. There's different examples for spheres there. Shemus, like names. Nevertheless, once you have Chochmah and Bina and Shtalshalus, even in Atzilus, their difference can teach us about higher levels because they originate ultimately from there. So Frierdiker Rebbe is saying, let's go now to Chochmah and Bina, and through that we'll understand Etzem Ispashtus better, and that will bring us back to understanding the Etzem and Ispashtus, the two levels of Ayin, in the third interpretation. But he's right now still talking about the first interpretation, Etzem and Ispashtus, Lifnei Tzimtzum in the Er HaBligvul. So what's Chochmah and Bina? So we'll sum up what we learned, and then we'll continue inside. Chochmah is like Etzem, and Bina is like Ispashtus. Chochmah, as he says, is a nekuda. It's a point. It's a concentrated point, and its power is specifically not an extension. It's a flash of an idea that comes to you. Bina will be the place where it gets expanded and extended and developed and so on, which we'll talk about in a moment. So it's a nekuda einin nimsheches, and he compares it to a mayon, to a wellspring. A wellspring is deep beneath the ground, it's under the ground, and it's not about kamos. It's not quality. It's not quantity. It's quality. It's connected to its source, b'mkedei. Once it gets out of the source, then it's already called a river, a nahar. So Chochmah is called a mayon, and Bina is called a nahar. Chochmah is called a wellspring, and Bina is called a river. Okay, so Nekudas HaChochmah is the concentrated point, Etzem. Now let's explain Bina. So he says, Bina, Ime Yes, even though it has mayonis, which means under the river, there's a source. Bina doesn't come from nowhere. There are well springs from where the river flows, and it extends a lot of eirach. And it's deep. So we have here three things. Bina has a source. It's long, meaning it extends, and it is very deep, and it's deep. But the main quality of a river is its width. It's its expansiveness. It's sachvus gdela. What does that mean? So he speaks about the keach habina. I'll just read this. I'll read from the bottom of the page because it was, why not read it again? 4 lines from the bottom. He says, "V'chenu b'keach habina, shehi hispashtus." Bina is extension, expression, expansion. U'lechenin yona hu arichis hahesber dafke. That's why the inyan of Bina is lengthy explanation, explicitly. It's not brief points. Chochmah is a brief point. Bina is arichis hahesber. Lefaret kol nekudas sichlis, to break down and separate and in detail every nekudas sichlis, every spark of an idea, every point, every concentrated point. Ulachalka, and to divide it l'ribei chalakim, to many sections. V'chol chelik l'ribei anofim, and every section to many branches. Bigdorim miyuchadim, different branches in different domains, categories. The chol onav hu geder miyuchad. Every branch is a specific geder, like I gave the example of Hilchos Shabbos. Once you break it down, there's the different aspects, the different facets. The chol onav l'ribui sifim. And every branch, every geder, in other words, category, breaks further down into a bunch of subcategories. Like branches continues to branch into smaller branches. Ubechol sif kamas svaris, and every sif, every subcategory has a number of theories and ideas. And every svara, every idea, come upon him shenim bechelke habeinu v'haseser. And every theory has different facets of that theory. In other words, different ways to explain it. As bechelke, as part of the brain of a sesa, as part as you build and you reject, essentially. You build and eliminate different aspects until you get your clarity. Shekol zeh, page 108, hu inyan shel habina. All this is the inyan of bina. Lefaret kol dover var hasogel levare lavne. To split, to break down, to specify every understandable idea, levarei, to separate or to clarify, or the lavne, to crystallize. Lavne like libun, crystal clear, white. You get a crystal picture. And that's why Bina is called the expansiveness of the river. This is more or less where we stopped. We're going to read from here now. So even though Bina has Maven Dover, Metech Dover, as I mentioned, you understand one idea leads to another. That's Eirich. That's like that is a vertical growth, vertical extension. There's horizontal, whereas harchava is what we're talking about now. The expanding it into a full-bodied entity, a full outline with every detail covered. And every detail of detail, all the categories, subcategories, sub-subcategories. That's called the expanse of the river. As opposed to the mayon, the nekuda of the mayon of chachma, which is just a spark, a concentrated point. So here we have etzem and ispastus. Remember, this is all coming to explain that. We'll get back to it, but meanwhile, he's going to go further. He's going to say like this. Why is Bina called a river? So he's going to elaborate on the river. He's going to discuss a river. Like, for example, an actual river. Like an example of a river, shemisrachev, that expands, very wide expanse. So you can have a very narrow river, but we're talking about a chevas anor, we're talking about a very expansive river. In a very, very, not just not just a great expansion, but a very great expansion. Umamala al kol gidesov, and it fills up over all the banks. Gidesov is the banks of a river, the edges. The zeu ika milas hanar. That's the main quality and feature of a river. Its expansiveness to the point that it basically overflows over the banks of the river. That's what a real river is. It does have banks. There is a point where it ends. It's not an ocean, but it's expansive and it's like overflows the edges. And he brings two Gemaras to prove this. Ukamaimer, the Gemara Nedarim, Daf Mem Omer Aleph, 48. Nore Mekifem is Baruch. A river is blessed. What's the word mekife mean? So there's two interpretations he's going to bring. From Rashi and from the Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim. Another mekife is bar. Mekife b'pashtus means mekife from its edges. So Rashi says, that's how Rashi teaches. Upirish Rashi, sheneva migdesov. It flows migdesov over it. In other words, it's blessed to flow over its edges. So you could have something, let's say the river, when it's a river, let's say is a little, on the dry season, they say a river dries up, not completely dries up. You could have a river flowing, but you can actually see you could see the banks are clear. It's like the tide is out. But a real river, when it's blessed, Mekifim is Baruch, the Gemara is saying that the river is flowing over the edges. So it's like literally you stand at the edge. Sometimes the river even goes overflows. But he's not necessarily talking about complete overflowing, but overflowing migidesov. That's what the Neveah means, to flow, migidesov. The Ran, Pirish, mikifai miseloi. Mikifai means, he says, from its stone, from its source. Kalema mimikere, whom is gadol. So Rashi is talking more about the actual overflowing of the river over its edges, over the banks, or to the banks and beyond. And the Ran says, Sela means a stone, but here he means Sela means from where the source of the river, where does the water of the river come from? So he says, Sela means Kamamkerehu Mizgadol, that the blessing is, Mekifim is Baruch, that the source is growing from the source, is giving it more water. In other words, it's getting more water from its source. Umistaya, Mahada Amru, and this is the Ran. Why is the Ran typed differently than Rashi? Rashi technically is basically telling us the blessing is that the river is at its widest expanse. It's not a river that's minimal, it's maximum. It's like saying when we say Moli v'Godush, when you fill up a cup, you can fill up a cup, but it doesn't pour over. Moli v'Godush means it's filled and a little more. That's a blessing. That's a siman bracha. It pours over. That's what we say. Fill up a cup that it should spill over, that the blessing should spill over. But the Ran has a different type. She's saying that the bracha is not about the spilling over, is that it's flowing more from the source. So the Ran has a raya. His raya comes from another Gemara. Mistaya Mahada Amr. Mistaya means he's supported. His explanation is supported from a Gemara, Tainis, Chafei Ayin Beis. The Gemara in Tainis 25b. So he says there the sugi is about rain and famine. The same sugi where it talks about Machim Cheni Hamagal, about the praying for rain. So he says like this: Ein lecha tefach mo maila, she'ein tehem yetzu likreisei gimel tfachim. So tefach mo maila, but pashtus means, like when we say mazel, ein lecha esav she'ein le mazel mo maila, I assume tefach literally is a measurement of a tefach. But he's saying that every tefach mo maila causes the tohim. Tohim we mentioned was even deeper than a mayon. A tohim is the what we call tohim is the in English the tohim is tachas tohim it's from the inner belly of the earth. We have the tohemis rabbis. A tohem is like a deep cavern. The deep caverns where. How does it attach tohem there?
In Pashtas, in my mind,
I think it's the innermost. Tohem means the innermost. It's like an innermost cavern or something like that.
The deepest.
Right, the deepest, right. V'hatahem. So okay, so one second. V'hatahem u'seloi haynu mekeidah shel hamayim. So the tahem is called seloi. Seloi means like it is the source of this water of the river. So basically, two interpretations in the words Mekifei Mizbarach. Rashi's interpretation, Mekifei means that it overpours, it spills over the edges, and the Ran, that it's coming from its deepest source. So the Frierdiker Rebbe now is going to discuss this. When you say Gdesav, which means the banks, the outer edges, that's the merchav, that's the width of the river. What we're talking about, the Selehu emek. This is the emek. You talk about the tahem, you're talking about where the water is coming from. So in other words, the river has two aspects to it. It has where's the water coming from? It's coming from deeper parts of the earth. That's the Ran's interpretation. And the Rashi's interpretation, which is depth, not width. Width and depth are two separate entities, two separate ideas. You could have a lot of expanse. For example, there are people who know how to learn well, and they know how to connect many ideas. They can expand the idea in many directions, but their depth is not necessarily as deep. Then there are people whose depth is there. Like, for example, the difference is Sinai and Eiker Harim. The Gemara talks about two types of minds. Sinai is Bekias. Someone knows a lot. It's very expansive. You give him one thought, and he'll right away bring you 50 other Gemaras and 50 other ideas and so on. Eiker Harim may not be that expansive, but Eiker Harim means he splits mountains. It's someone who knows how to go deep into a topic and analyze it and dissect it. So one is more depth and one is more width or breadth. And here, so Rashi and Ran basically, one is talking about width, one is talking about depth. They're two different things. Aval be'emes, says the Frierdiker Rebbe, the depth, dafke, brings the width, brings the expansion. Vaha talia, and they're interdependent. That's all he says. I'm sure there's more about this in other Maimarim. I'd have to look. So let me just explain as I understand it. I mean, like I just said, Sinai and Eiker Harim are seen as, they're not seen as interdependent. They're seen as actually two different types of people. In the Gemara also you have, in the Mishnah, Boir Sud She'enim Abetipa. And then you have Mayanam is Gaber. That's the same idea. Boir Sud She'enim Abetipa is someone who's like absorbs everything. He doesn't lose anything. He remembers everything. It's like a Mayanam is Gaber is like depth. It's a mayon, a wellspring, Mizgaber, that's stronger and stronger. It's never ending. Just to give examples. So he's saying, there are two things. So he says, be'emes, it's not the correct. The emes, the expansion of the river is dependent, he says, basically, on the depth. If the water of the Tahim was not flowing in a blessed way, then the river would not have water to go over the edges. That's what he's saying. That the merchav is told in the oimek. Take away the oimek, take away the tahim, the depth, then you won't have that expansion. Where's it coming from? It's not coming from nowhere. That seems to be the obvious, but I have a few questions on that, even though I'm myself explaining it that way. Well, when it comes to a river, you could also say a river is blessed, not necessarily from the tahim. It could be the rains. The rains can make a river overflow. So God blesses someone with rain, a country with rain, a river with rain, that also it's not coming from the Tahim. So I'm not sure, I have to look into this a little more, but he clearly says what I just said. He says it's that the expansion is dependent on the depth. So the Ran is focusing on the source, and the Rashi is focusing on the expansion. Now, why this is necessary here, I'm not so sure. Because he wants to really say, remember earlier he said that the main focus with Mabina on the river is width, not depth. But I guess he's qualifying it by trying to explain that depth, that width comes with depth, and depth leads to width. So it's not exclusively only width and expansion, it's also depth. Maybe he's coming to say that his pashtus also has something, some source. I'm not sure. Not sure. But what we've learned now, we've learned. So basically, he's now going to go back to Etzem and his pashtus. So we've discussed that Bina primarily is expansion and width, like a river. And then he brought the Gemaras, then the two interpretations that it also refers to depth. And the depth feeds the width, and Haba'atalia, actually the width also seems to feed the depth. Haba'atalia means they're both interdependent. Okay. So now he goes on and says like this. V'zeu ha'hefresh ben etzem li'hispashtus. And this is the difference between etzem and hispashtus, between a core entity and its expression or expansion. The etzem nekuda she'einin sheches. The etzem is a nekuda, is a point that doesn't extend, that doesn't transmit. It is what it is and it stays there. Va'ispashtus hu yisrachvus. And hispashtus means expansion, or hispashtus means extension, hu yisrachvus is expansion. Extension is expansion. Sachlis means with, expanding with. Ulechein hine b'nekuda eine shaykh ribuy amiyut. And that's why in Nekuda, it's not possible to say ribuy amiyut, more and less, or less. Shenemar, as if to say, asher reishis hanekuda hi meruba be'er, seichel. Legabe emtsiusa v'seifa. In other words, when you talk about a nekuda, you can't say a nekuda doesn't have a top and a bottom. It's a concentrated dot, a point, drop, a flash. So to say reishis hanekuda, the beginning of nekuda, is more meruba be'er, is filled with more light. The air seichel. Legabe emtsiusa v'seifa, compared to the middle and the end of the nekuda. You can't say that. He's being shale, you can't say that. In other words, when you get a flash of an idea in Chokhmah, you can't break it into parts. You can't say, oh, the beginning of my flash was this way, the end of this, because it's all one flash, it's one spark. The one spark is all concentrated. So there's no talking about more and less. There's no structure. It's an idea, yes, it's an idea, but if it stops there and there's no bina, that's all it is. It's a nekuda. It's a dot. We spoke about a dot. It's not a line. It's not a river yet. Mashen can be spashtus, the bina. Mashen can, in contrast, the expansion or expression or expansion, extension, expansion, of bina, the eir ha-seichel mischalik b'malosei. Here in bina, the eir ha-seichel, the idea of seichel that was in Chochmah, one nekuda, mischalik b'malosei. It divides in quality in the different parts of understanding, because Bina by definition is breaking it down into parts. The Eina Dema Eira Seichel Shebesvara, and I was going what he said earlier. Remember, there was the Svara, the Onof, the Chelik, the Sif, and all that. He says, you can't compare. Ein Adem is not comparable. The Eira Seichel means the energy of the idea. Shebesvara, in a theory, La Eir Seichel Sheba Onof. To the Seichel, the Eira Seichel within the branch. I'll explain this in a minute. Va'onof Ein Adem la Chelik. And the branch is not compared to a section. Ubachalokim Gufar Yeshbem Hevdel B'ribu Yamiyat. And the sections, each of them, are different in ribu yamiyut. Ribu meaning in intensity or less, or even in kamos, even in quantity, more and less. A second. The liyes, the klolos in asago is pastus. Why is this the case? Because Bina is the klolos of asaga, of understanding something, is specifically ispashtus. It's all about a breakdown and expansion of details. And in an energy that extends, the more it transmits, the more diminished it gets. Okay. This is now going to take us back to Mamala Kalalman. So before we go there, let me just explain this. I think the example with Hilchas Shabbos works very well here. The Torah says Leisasa Kol Malacha, or the different aces in Chumash about the Isra of Malacha on Shabbos. If you just read that, what would it mean? It says you shall not do work on Shabbos. So first of all, what does work mean? Which work? If you just go that's a general klal, that Shabbos is Shabbos LaHashem. Kedushu, Shabbos Kedush, LaHashem. And therefore, it's not a day for mundane work, which means Sheshes Yom Tasa Melachtecha, or B'yem Shvi, what's the love of Shabbos, what's the lashon in the Seres HaDibros? Sheshes Yom Tasa Melachtecha, B'yem
Shabbos L'Hashem Elokecho.
Right. Shabbos L'Hashem Elokecho. Okay. So B'Pashtus, what does that mean? It's a very powerful statement, but it's a nekuda. that 6 days of the week you shall do your work. What is your work? Go to work, your job, etc., etc. On Shabbos is a day for Hashem. Don't go to work. Now, if you stop there, all you have is the spirit of Shabbos. What do I mean by the spirit? The Nukud is. Why? Because 6 days of the week, God created the world. And on the seventh day, God rested. God stopped creation. So you too create for 6 days, and then on Shabbos, dedicated to God. I mean, you could explain it in many ways. I'm not going now into the explanation. I'm just stating that. But we know that does not tell us what exactly is not allowed. So what does malacha mean? Are you allowed to pick up a cup in your house? Can you pick up a heavy piece of furniture in your house? Api halacha, yeah. But how do we know that? Comes the Torah Shebal Peh, that learns from the fact that there's lamates malachas in the Mishkan. And since in Parsha Vayakel, the Parsha Mishkan comes after Parsha Shabbos, which seems out of place. So we learn from that all the malachas, what is defines a malacha, is a work that was done in the Mishkan. And that breaks down to 39. So now you have a breakdown. So the loisasa kol malacha is still applicable, but it's a very general statement. It's a klal. It's a nekuda. Now you break it down to 39. Now, when you get to the 39, each one of them itself has a whole hilchas halachas. So that breaks down even further. And each level, as you break it down, is a different level of seichel than a previous one. For example, the general statement that you shall not, for example, havarim reshus l'reshus. You shall not carry from reshus hayochid to reshus harabim, from a private domain to a public domain. That's a general statement. When you start learning the halachas about that, you know how many details there are? So he's basically saying, in contrast to the nekudas haskalah, chochmah, which is an etzem and there's no extension, there's also a general statement. Here, the exact opposite. Every statement, every detail, and every category and subcategory is a lower level of seichel than the general category. That's what he's basically saying. So his pashtus is by definition, structure by definition, means details. And this fits very well because when you say, for example, the ovis melachis, then you have tuldas. What's a tulda? A tulda means an offspring. It means a subcategory in a general category. So there are things that are also in the general category. Obviously, that's a much more eira seichel there because it's a general category. When you break it down, then you're specifically focusing on a particular specific detail. And the details are always weaker in the seichel. Now, let me explain. When I say weaker, it doesn't mean you don't need to use your mind. Sometimes a detail can be very deep. And you need to work hard at it. But if you talked about, obviously, a general category is always going to have more seichel in it, more ideas than a specific category. By definition, it just encompasses more. When you talk about a siman in Shulchan Aruch, it has more than a sif in Shulchan Aruch. And every sif has svaras in it. And each svara is, in a sense, a lower level than the general sif. So basically, seichel is like a river, bina that is. The bina is a river that branches and branches and branches to the point there's some details that are so small, so specific, so an iota. So it would be like you say seichel there is b'miut compared to the general idea that brought you to that specific detail. That's essentially what he's saying. So we have an example for etzem and ispashtus in Chachma and Bin. Now you have to say that the Afidik Rebbe adding this means it's adding something, the Havana of our whole discussion here. The question is, what is this adding that we wouldn't understand without? Because when you learn Ayin Beis, he doesn't bring this whole Chachma and Bina. All this is Afidik Rebbe's addition. What don't we understand from etzem and ispashtus and Eir, Lifnei Tzimtzum or Mamala, that Chachma and Bina adds? That's a good question. I'm thinking about it. I'm not sure. I mean, it gives us a better understanding of etzem and ispashtus. That's correct. But how does it help us in understanding this whole subject matter? So maybe let's read a little further. Maybe it'll become clear. How the Frierdiker Rebbe connects it now. So now he says, okay, and this is a line we've read a few times already, that something that's mispeira mispashit, harikol mashu nimshach yesem mismayed b'amshachase. That's a line that we learned already. I want to just find it earlier. It was very clear when he said that. On page 51, he already said that clearly. That A'ira Mispashit is Mismayit B'hamshachose.
And also on page 52. Making of Shachasayel Amairo, the Inyan Hamshachose Mismayet Ho'oil.
Right. That's an extension, a continuation, yeah. I'll tell you one thing that comes to mind that's very clear here with Chochmah and Bina, which I think helps. I'm just thinking how it's contributing to the whole Havana here, is that God created existence. Remember, God does not need etzem or ispashtus. So the whole thing really is for us to be able to have a handle to relate to Elokus. So we, of course, relate far more to ispashtus than to atzmi. You know, etzem, things that are atzmim are beyond us. We may have an etzem and a shama, but we don't relate to it. If I want to speak to you, I'm speaking now. Is this my etzem aseichel, or is this ispashtus aseichel? So the idea that you have both really helps the whole interface, because one reflects more the core essence of the source. That's etzem. Hispashtus is already, you can say, relates to existence because it extends itself, it structures. You know, a good example may be the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. It says, "B'asara ma'amoros nivrei olam," that God, 10 utterances, 10 statements, He created the world. Then it says, "V'aloi b'maimer echad yachal yibaris," He could have created it with one maimer. What's the maimer? Gemara says, "Bereshis bara lekimus hashemayim v'saaretz." God could have created the world by just saying, "Bereshis bara lekimus hashemayim v'saaretz." We know, as Rashi says, Hashemayim v'aretz includes everything. Shemayim v'tel deseh, eretz v'tel deseh. Everything is either a heavenly creation or something on earth. Whether it's the heavens, whether it's desha of the vegetation, whether it's the luminaries, whether it's fish, animals, human being. So the Mishnah says, why did he create then 10? So he says, in order to give schar and einish. But Chassidus explains deeper. Maimer echad yochli baras, he did create it with Bereshis bara. Rashi and the Ramban explain that in the first moment of creation, everything was in Heyuli. Everything was like a concentrated, like we spoke about conception. Everything was concentrated in one cell, like a nakuda. But then you wouldn't have the structure of existence. And the Eibishter wanted a structure. So therefore, the first day, Yehi Oyer. So from the Maimer Echad came 10 Maimoras. Yehi Oyer, Yehi Rakia, Teitzeres Desha, Yehi Me'eris, etc. The Alter Rebbe in Tanya in Shaykhid V'Amunah says the 10 utterances, 10 statements, don't cover all of existence. Doesn't say any of the 10 statements, Evan. So he says because the 10 statements all include the Chav Beis Asius, with which God created the world. They're just different sirufim. So if you take the 22 letters in the 10 Maimoros, it breaks down even further that every aspect of creation is some permutation and some combination of the Hebrew letters in the Asara Maimoros. It's similar to how the Rebbe explains from the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's a good way to visualize this, that the whole Torah, all Tayyag Mitzvahs, all included in the Aseres HaDibros, the 10 Commandments. Rav Saadia Gaon says that. The 10 commandments are all included in the first 2 commandments. Anoichi v'layilcha, it says in Tanya. Anoichi is the root of all positive mitzvahs, 248 positive. And layilcha is the root of all 365 negative. Then goes further. And both of them are included in Anoichi, Hashem Alekecha. And all of Anoichi Hashem Alekecha is included in the one word Anoichi, I. And the whole Anoichi is included in the Aleph of Anoichi. So when you teach a child Aleph, in it lies Anoichi, Anoichi Hashem Alekecha, Layilacha, 10 Commandments, and Kol HaTeira Kula. But it's all in the Aleph, it's a Nekuda. You don't see the distinction. You can't take an Aleph and figure out the rest of the mitzvahs without it being spelled out. So why do you need both? Because you want to have, in the interface, you want to have both. You want to know everything. Kol HaTeira Kula is all about Achdus Hashem. The Aleph of Hashem, Anoichi. Aleph. But the Eibishter wanted a Dira B'Tachtenim. He didn't want just Achdus, Aleph. He wanted the Aleph to be sensed in the details, all the way to the smallest details. So it breaks apart that section by section. Goes exactly like he said here. First it breaks into a word, Anoichi, and then to a dibur, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha asher hoshicha me'eretz Mitzrayim, then Layilacha L'kim Acherim, then 10 Commandments, which by the way have 620 letters, which is 613 mitzvahs. Some say the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Neach, some say the 7 mitzvahs d'Rabbanon. However you explain it. And then it breaks down to every specific detail. So someone say, which one is it? Both. Because you want everything to know what's the punchline. The punchline is God. Eined Mulvade. But that's not enough. That's Lifnei Tzimtzum. Everything is like concentrated into one. If you want existence, you need Hispashtus. And Hispashtus comes into details, and details means that it gets diminished. In the Aleph, the intensity of energy in one Aleph that has Kol HaTeira, you can imagine. Once it's broken down, it's still Teira, and it's holy. But now it's a detail, and it's not, doesn't have that same potency, so to speak, of, let's say, Anoichi. Or in this case, I said, Bereishis Bara, Maimerhu, Nami Maimerhu. That breaks into the 10, which breaks into further. The point is that all of existence needs both Etzem and Hispashtus. And Chacham and Bina are a very good way of understanding it, because the intellectual process begins with a concentrated idea, which then is split and broken down like a river spreading to the edges, from the depth of the river all the way to the edges to the width. Maybe that's why he brought the idea of depth, because maybe he wanted to show that Bina is rooted ultimately in Chachma. Maybe that's what he wants to say. Because remember, the Nod comes from a Mayan. The Mayan comes from the Tahim. So maybe that's what he wants to say, that at the end of the day, the Hispashtus comes from the Etzem. It's taka a different level, it's expansion now, and the Etzem is not expanding, but the expansion is rooted in Etzem. Maybe that's why he brought the Emek. I'm just speculating. That may be the reason he brought it. Actually makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Now he's going to bring it back to the topic at hand. But before I do that, before I continue, if anybody wants to ask or say something on this topic, or we just continue? Okay. Let's continue. Yeah. So now he says, after okay, that works well, because remember we said it about the kav earlier too. As it goes down, it gets them. That's what makes milo mata. Structure is only possible when there are levels. If everything is the same level of intensity, there's no milo mata. So it's all about structure. Okay, good. So now he says, he's finished with the Chachman Bina. He's now bringing it back. So just as we spoke about Etzem Hispashtus in the air before the Tzimtzum, remember the beginning of the topic on the previous page, that there's 2 levels. Hainu Bashita Aleph, which means in the first Shita, in the first approach, in the first application of ayin. What was the first? The ayin hamamutza ben yesh amiti v'yesh hamisavu etzem eir v'hispashtus eir. That means, just as it is in the first approach, that there's etzem and hispashtus, and that's the two levels of ayin before the tzimtzum. The ayin between the yesh amiti, the true reality, and the created reality. What is that? Etzem eir, the eir that reflects atzmus, and hispashtus eir, the eir that begins to envision or begins to desire existence, I should say, starting from, if you remember, a consideration and then deliberation and then determination and so, etc. The etzem ha'er hu ayin diyesh amiti, that the etzem of the eir in the first interpretation is the ayin of the yesh amiti, v'hispashtus ha'er hu ayin diyesh hamisava, and the extension or expression of the light of the energy is the ayin of the created yesh. Hine Kenhu, now he's going back to what he began. Same thing, Kenhu, or similar, Gamba Shita Shlishis. Also in the third interpretation, that it's all in Mamala Kalalmin. The Klolos Ayinu Er Panimi, calls it Er Panimi. That the general ayin is Er Panimi. So just as Etzem and Hispashtus is the two levels of ayin in the first approach, same thing in the third approach, where we're talking that it's all Er Panimi, not before the Tzimtzum. Er Panimi, that there's also these two levels, V'er Panimi zeh mischalik l'shnayim. And this internal, immanent energy divides into two. Hainu, the Klolos Er, Yesh Beis Madreges. That means that the general Er Panimi has two levels. V'hu b'chinas etzem ha'er. The first level is etzem ha'er, shu b'chinas dveikus mamash ba'atzmes ein sof. Even the Er Panimi, etzem of the Er Panimi, which is that it's mamash connected, attached to the source, to Er Ein Sof. I'm going to explain this a little more. We already discussed it in Ayin Beis, but I'll explain in a minute what he's saying. Maybe I should stop. Let me explain. So what's he saying here? You know, until now, we would have thought that Etzem Ha'er is exclusive to Lifnei HaTzimtzum and exclusive to Eir HaBligvul. What does that mean? That the first step from Bilta Metzias Nimtza Atzmos to the first expression of a Metzias Nimtza is the Eir Etzem Ha'er, which, as we said, all it is a reflection of Atzmos. But it's a reflection. It's Eir, but nothing more. After that begins Hispashtus Ha'er, and that's where you have a desire for existence and the more details of the desire to the point of envisioning, to the point of the tzimtzum, then comes the kav, etc. What he's saying now is, Eir be'etzem, every Eir, whether it's Eir Bligvul or Eir HaGvul, Eir HaPnimi, has etzem and hispashtus. Etzem reflects the Eir as it's expressing what its source wants. So the difference between like this, the etzem of Eir HaBligvul, they're the source all at once, meaning Atzmus wants an Eir that reflects all of him as much as possible. So it's Eir HaBligvul. Eir HaGvul also has an etzem to it. It's what the etzem wants in Eir HaGvul. What does the etzem want in Eir HaGvul? I want an energy that will ultimately be tailored to existence. At this point in etzem, it's only negay what the etzem wants. What difference? Remember, we learned just like God has the echelis, the possibility to create bligvul, he has the possibility to create gvul. Just as the possibility to radiate, lahoya, yecholte shalele, not to radiate. So there's an etzem in both of these kavim. In atzmus, they're all equal because there are no two. But when you talk about the Eir now, the Eir HaBligvul and the Eir HaGvul, they both have an etzem. The etzem wants this one to be Eir HaBligvul, and the etzem here wants it to be Eir HaGvul. So from the point of view of the Eir, also Eir HaPnimi has an etzem ha'Eir. Its etzem ha'Eir is what the etzem wants it to be. Hispashtus, on the other hand, is the focus on the function of that Eir. So when it comes to Eir HaBligvul, the function is a Bligvul dika function, which will then extend and turn into a desire, into more details, etc. the function of Er HaPnimi is to become the kav that will actually enter and permeate and enter bepnimius internally into each part of existence. So that's what he's adding now. Initially, we spoke the kav is the two levels of ayin. He said, no, oir, just like in the interpretation one, there's etzem and nispashtus and eir ha-bligvul, eir lifnei tzimtzum, the same thing with eir ha-pnimi. There's also etzem and nispashtus. That's what he's adding here now. How's that?
Does that mean that there's two etzims here? Etzem mamala
There's
and
no such
etzem.
thing as two etzem. There's only
That's
one
what I
etzem.
thought. So how could? So then what's that?
Atzmus is the only etzem. In Oyer, there's etzem Oyer, is pashtus Oyer. Just like there's etzem achochem, is pashtus achochem. There's etzem habina, is pashtus habina. That's not two etzem. Each level has the etzem in it, which relates to its source and has its function.
Und Shita Beis.
That's Fishita Beis. It's a good question. I'm not sure. He doesn't say. Why can't you say Shita Beis? The problem is there. It's Seva v'Mamala. Some very background loud noise. Maybe everyone mute while I speak. If you want to ask, you'll unmute. Shita Beis, I have to think about it. First of all, it's Lifnei Tzimtzum and Echelat Tzimtzum, Seva v'Mamala. It doesn't speak there. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't seem to fit etzem ha'er and spashtus ha'er. There you could say seviv is the etzem ha'er and mamal is the spashtus ha'er. Maybe like that. Yeah, you could say that technically. But you know what? Let's first master what he's saying here. We'll get back to it. I won't forget. So now he continues and says the following. We're not just talking the dveikus that's through the tzimtzum. In other words, before when we're speaking about the kav, which I'll read in a moment, we spoke the kav after the tzimtzum, comes the kav, chazir v'hoyer, it returns and radiates, and it's negei of a dovuk to Eir Ein Sof. And we said that was the ayin of the Yesh Amiti in the first interpretation of the third approach. He's saying now we're talking about dveikus of Er Pnimi to its source. It's not just the dveikus that comes after the tzimtzum. It's Ayidei tzimtzum. Kamay hakav b'chlal, like the kav in general. Shenegei v'dovuk be'Eir Ein Sof, that it touches and is attached to Eir Ein Sof, because remember the kav is attached at the top. Aval hu Ayidei tzimtzum. But that comes through the tzimtzum. That comes after the pause of the tzimtzum, which dramatically changed the personality of the kav, of the light. As we learned, it was a leap. It was a lower level. Naful madrigose. Mashenka ba'er atzmi. Mashenka, what we're talking about here, the er atzmi, which is in the er pnimi, shu b'bchinas dveikus mamash, shu b'bchinas atzmus ein sof baruch hu. It's dveikus mamash, and it's in the b'chinas atzmus ein sof baruch hu, which means there's no pause. It's the etzem of the kavana of er pnimi. Kamoshi is bored in Mitzvah Hashem, as shall be explained with God's help. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes exactly what the Rebbe Rashab said. Kamoshi is bored. He just adds in Mitzvah Hashem. So it's not over yet. He's going to discuss this more at length. V'hu er atzmi she'ena b'chinas hamshacha v'gili be'etzem. So this er atzmi, also in pnimi, is not hamshacha v'gili be'etzem. It's not subject to extension, to transmission and revelation. Fundamentally, not shaykh. V'hainu, the be'er hazeh lo yesh chiluki madreges. in this energy of light, there are no distinct levels. The Ein Shayach Boy, and it's not possible. It's not subject to any diminishment from level to level, because we're not talking about ispashtus, we're talking about etzem ha'ed. So the way I explained it, now the Rebbe Rashab and Frierdiker Rebbe may explain it differently. I believe this is the point. The way I explained it is that in Mamala, just in Pnimi, just like in Makif, in Era Bligvul, just like in Era Bligvul, there's a place where it meets its source. And there, all it is negaya there is not its function to be Pnimi or not Pnimi. It's all is negay is what Atzmus Kavana in it is. And there's a point, as we said, in Atzmus B'chal, there's no difference between one and the other. There, everything is equal. It's all God's capacity. But even as they come as two tracks, which means Lifnat Simtsum, Eira Bligvul, Eira Gvul, there's an aspect to them that's Atzmi. The Atzmi of the Eira Bligvul, of Eira Gvul, is that all it is an expression of God. Just as Eira Bligvul is an expression of God. So where's their distinction? Distinction is from our perspective, but not from the Atzmus perspective. So the Er Atzmi, therefore, is the Er Atzmi of Mamala, of Pnimi. That's what appears to be the pshat here. He doesn't say it explicitly what I just said, but I'm trying to explain what he means by this. Because if not, you're going to have a problem. Because Er Pnimi, we've been learning till now, the whole Er Pnimi is about existence. It's a Er Hashayach Le'elemus. That's why it's Pnimi. But he's now adding, no, there's a part of Pnimi. Even the Er Hashayach Le'elemus has an aspect that it's not about the elements. It's about God saying, I want an Er that will ultimately become Shayach Le'elemus. So, to put it in more Balbatisha words, okay? There's a Rebbe, a Mishaleach, and a Shliach. The Mishaleach says to the Shliach, I want you to go and represent me and raise money for my mojdus. Like people who were shadar. They went around, they raised maimed, which were beis harav, money that would go to the Rebbe himself and his family, the Rebbe's tzedakos. Okay. So then there was shluchim, the Rebbe said, no, I want you to go build a moised, build a yeshiva, a shul, a beis Chabad, an empire, whatever it may be, and don't send me the money. I want you to build there and make sure that the institution is successful. That's your shlichus. That's your shlichus. To build the structures and to build mozdus that relate to the people there. And then there were others that, as I said, that the Rebbe went and sent them, even sometimes to cities where shluchim were built, and went to raise money for the Rebbe's stakis, the Rebbe's inyan. So if you look at it from a point of view of a outsider, from a viewer, someone living in the city, so his benefit, he gets benefit from the local Chabad institutions. He doesn't see direct benefit from the Rebbe's Meisters, Merkez Inyan Chinuch, or Machne Yisrael, or Kahos, or the Rebbe's personal zdakis, the different kronis. Maybe indirectly, but directly for sure not. So he could say, I want to give money to my local shliach. And shluchis shalom kamese, he represents the Rebbe. So he's also giving, in effect, to the Rebbe, but the Rebbe as it is through the shliach. So from a point of view of structure, there's definitely different channels here, different tracks. But from the point of view of the Ratzon HaMelech, the Ratzon HaMishaleach, and I use the word Ratzon hesitantly, so maybe the Ratzon is not the right word. The Kavanas HaMishaleach, what he is intention. If he chose you to do the first job or the second job, what difference does it make? The etzem of the oir in each one is equal. It's whatever the Mishaleach wants. But the spashtus, there's definitely a difference. The functionality of the oir is very different. This one has a certain function, this one has a different function. You can't mix the two. So my point I'm saying is that oir, for it to be truly reflective of the Mashalech Atzmus, even a Pnimi has a direct connection and is driven. Remember, it's Oyer, it's not Keli. It's Pnimi. Oyer is Me'ena Moyer. But the Moyer expands in Blikvul different ways, as we learned. But we also learned that God is not bound or defined by Blikvul. So the same Etzem that gives off Blikvul Oyer can give off Agvul, Pnimi. And in that level, all is negay is that Atzmus wants it. That's it. The Kavanas Atzmus in it. When you talk functionality, meaning expression, so the expression of the Eira Blikvul takes on a particular track that we learned. It goes through a Rotzen, through a Heskim, and a Shakavitarya, and a Achlota, and then a Rotzen Kloli, that's a Rotzen Prati, and then a Rotzen Akodum, etc., etc. Till Shir Atzmei B'Keach. The Eira Gvul has its own trajectory, and it'll ultimately end up being the Kav after the Tzimtzum. But if you go all the way to the top of where that electric line, if you wish, that energy field of energy began, who decided it should be Eir Pnimi? Not Eir Makif. Everything comes from Atzmus. So if you go back to trace it back to the source, you basically have two kavanas, one general kavan, obviously, but it takes on two elements. I want to have an Eir that will reflect me and create bittul in the worlds. That's its function we learned in Ayin Beis in volume 1. And we'll learn about it more later. And another Eir that actually identifies with and relates to existence. But from the point of the Eir Atzmi Shebezeh, they're both. That's the Kavanas Atzmus. So what he's adding here is that even in Eir Pnimi, the Chidush here is that even Eir Pnimi, which ultimately will have a very specific function, that function is an hispashtus of the Eir. The etzem of the Eir Pnimi is also a beyond Hamshach, above and beyond Hamshacha and Gili. Because all it is a reflection of what Atzmus ultimately intention is. So this makes the interface, frankly, a lot more intricate. Because when we are in our Aveda, whether we're working with Aveda Alpitam V'das, meaning an Aveda that's connected to structure, Seder V'Adrag, 6 days of the week we work, and then comes Shabbos, or the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, El, this is a Seder V'Adrag. Every month has its own Aveda. Every day of the week, Kol Yema V'Yema over Davidite. Shachris is not Mincha, Mincha is not Ma'ariv, and on and on and on. So you could say, you know what? We connect to God in a limited way. But if you really want to connect to the deepest, you need Eira Blikvul. You need Mesiras Nefesh. You need to go out of your parameters. This adds that no, even in your Pratizdika, specific Pnimizdika work, there's also a piece of it, if you go to trace it all the way back, that has an Atzmi that connects you straight to the source. Now, obviously, as I discussed a number of times, the way the Eibishter made it was the Pnimi speaks to the Makif and the Makif speaks to the Pnimi. So the Blikvul and Gvul are not just two separate tracks. In Aveda, Mesiras Nefesh and Kabbalah Soil and Yechida or Yom Kippur is not divorced, God forbid, from the rest of the year. It's just two different manifestations. And as we learned, the Blikvul leads to the Gvul, because Shir Atzmei B'Kreach, when God envisioned one type of art, the 10 spheres, that is also a manifestation of Blikvul. And the other way around, after the Tzimtzum, the Blikvul, the Igulim, also have structure because they go through the Kav. So in addition to what I just said, that each track connects to the Etzem, and there's the Etzem also of the Ispashtus of Mamala, Pnimi, there's also the Iskalulus interactivity between both of them. So if you really develop this, it's a very intricate system of interfaces that are working with each other while they're also doing different functions. They all connect to the Etzem, then they have their specific details. So however you twist and turn it, the Blikvul is going to have Gvul emerge within it, emerge. and the gvul is going to have bli gvul emerge in it. Ultimately, we are small people. We can't digest it all at once. So we're told, go step by step. Sometimes you'll go a little higher. B'chol nafshecha, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol ma'idecha. Ma'idecha, relatively speaking, is a little more than regular. If you keep on working both tracks, your pnimis dik aveda and your mesiris nefesh aveda, meaning going beyond your capacity, so to speak, your regular das and amuna, seichel and amuna. You use your intelligence, but then there's the makif of amuna above it, and you keep growing. You are going to be, in all many ways, interconnecting to all these levels as they get closer and closer to Atzmus. So you have everything here. You have structure, you have beyond structure. In structure, you have beyond structure. And in beyond structure, you have structure. So transcendence and immanence are all interwoven on so many different levels. That's really the underlying message here. I'm spelling it out because without that, it becomes like, why is he insisting on pushing Atzmi in Mamala, in Pnimi? Could say Mamala is, Pnimi is after the Tzimtzum, because he wants this connection on all levels, that the Prat and the Klal, they should all work together. I hope what I just said was helpful, because that really is at the crux of the real underlying theme in this Ayin Beis that he's explaining now. Quite fascinating, no?
It's a lot to digest.
Yeah. But let's put it this way. I would suggest in this context to not process too much and try to absorb as much as possible, and there'll plenty of time to process. Because it's, yeah.
Gut gesagt.
I would stop here simply because of what you just said, digesting. You know, mafsik ben parsha la parsha, as we've been discussing. It's I don't know. I can't tell you. It's hard for me to contain. I'm very excited about it. It's just so, in my opinion, so mind-boggling, because the extent of this interface, like, you know, usually say, okay, bli gvul is here and gvul is here. Pnimi, makif here becomes all, the Achdus Hashem in each of them is so fundamental. At the same time, they have their specific functions. It's quite something. What can I tell you? It's a true formula. It's a true formula for total integration, to be honest. That's what it is.
Like he said before, that the etzem is the hischalkus. In the hischalkus, you see the etzem.
Yeah, that's also correct. Exactly. Koyach ha'atzmus machriach. Yeah, Yechelis. Correct. So this is where you get to. You know, most people would say, okay, when I see oneness in existence, I see unity. It's a reflection of the divine. But when I see diversity, it's a reflection of the tzimtzum. And he says, no. Diversity is the power of the divine in diversity. The tzimtzum allows it to happen. But at the end of the day, correct. Yeah, you could see atzmus in a grain of sand, b'kitzur. Shova mashva kotin v'gadol, just as much as you see it in the largest expanses. I think that may also help understand the Bina. Because what was Bina? Bina is taking an idea from Chochmah and Fabreklendos and like breaking it down in so many details. But all those details are part of the larger picture. They're not external details. It's the Nekuda being seen through the details. So even though the details are diminished and there are different levels, but at the end of the day, Bina is not some entity that's separate from Chachma, God forbid. is the Nekudas HaChochma that became a river, essentially. Yeah.
Like the marshal that I gave with two friends, Svar Toivo, and the question.
Yeah. Okay, so let's stop here. At 2/3 down, page 108. We still have to talk about Espashtus Sa'ir, which we'll discuss. And the Frierdiker Rebbe now is going to elaborate more than the Ayin Beis. So it's going to give us some more Havana understanding in all these matters. And we'll continue tomorrow at 9:30.